Hello everybody, today we're going to be looking at this video called Debunking Transphobia by a channel called Malmrose Projects. This is part 2 of the video, and I would recommend that if you haven't seen part 1, you watch it by clicking on the link that should be up here, because definitely you're going to want to see some of the other arguments Malmrose made, and I can't guarantee that what we see in this video won't be building off the points made by Malmrose Projects in the previous video. Ultimately, I just decided to stop watching the video when we got a little bit over halfway through. I don't know how long this video is going to be. It could be that in the second half, there's hardly anything to comment on, in which case, this will be a nice short video, but perhaps there will be a huge amount to comment on, in which case there will be a much longer video awaiting you. You can already tell from looking at the length of the video. I can't. And that's something I accept. Anyway, we're now going to start watching the video, responding to it, and seeing whether or not this debunking of transphobia, which seems to be actually more accurately described as a debunking of the claim that trans identities aren't valid, whether or not these debunkifications actually hold water. So let's check it out.
Intersex conditions demonstrate that the male-female dichotomy is not real, but is socially constructed. If it were a true dichotomy, there would be no exceptions. Gerald N. Callahan, an associate...
I just want to also add, because I didn't add it last time, even if it were true that there was not a sex binary, that would be irrelevant, right? It would be irrelevant to biological males claiming to be women. Like... you can still argue, like it would actually be perfectly coherent to argue that biological sex is heck, even a bimodal distribution, as people who don't know what they're talking about like to claim, and simultaneously say that people who are on the biological male section of the bimodal distribution can't be women. Like that would still be a perfectly coherent position. What you would have to argue is that the ambiguity of biological sex, or the supposed ambiguity of biological sex, in and of itself would mean that biological sex can no longer serve as a referent for whether or not somebody is a man or woman. And you also have to, of course, argue that gender identity, which I'd argue is far more ambiguous and far less meaningful, should instead be our referent for whether somebody's a man or woman. So yeah, even if I were to grant all of this, it still wouldn't be a justification for saying that trans identities are valid. I could just say, well, if you're biologically male, I don't care if there are exceptions. If actually, it turns out there are people who are neither biologically male nor biologically female, whatever. Even still, I could still say if you're biologically male, you can't be a woman. So yeah, it doesn't even, like, this argument, as bad as it was, and you'll have to go to part 1 to see how bad the argument was, doesn't even defend the position it's trying to defend.
and who wrote a book on intersex people titled Between XX and XY, said in an interview, quote, "The persistence of intersex reminds me that there's a continuum, that we isolate people in the middle and say that they have a problem because they're reproductively incompetent or don't look right or whatever. None of us meet the criterion of being the perfect male or the perfect female. We are all intersex."
That is a take right there. None of us meets the criterion of being the perfect male. Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of true, in that there's no such thing as like a perfect male. Males, I mean, again, the issue is that the idea of like perfect male or perfect female existing would make more sense if sex is a continuum. Because, of course, if sex is a binary, then the idea of being like the perfect male or perfect female makes no sense. It's like if somebody said, well, I'm right-handed, but this person is the perfect right-handed. It's like, no, there's no perfect. There's no like better or worse version of right-handed. It's just right-handed. And, obviously the left-right binary is just an easy thing to go to. But yeah, you can apply it to any other binary. Ultimately, think of any binary you can, and you're going to realize the idea of being like perfectly that thing doesn't make any sense, because you either are that thing or you aren't. Now, conversely, if you're dealing with a continuum, you could kind of maybe talk about things being perfect. For example, you could argue that absolute zero is perfect cold. And why could you argue that? Because it's a continuum, right? Like you'd be, well, if for example you said that the more cold you are, it's like the better you are at being cold. So, well, you might be -5 degrees, but I'm -10 degrees. Well, obviously, if you take that to its logical conclusion, then you say, well, the maximally cold you can be, which you might call the perfect cold, would be absolute zero. So actually, it's a continuum that would allow for the idea of people being perfectly male or perfectly female. So what we're actually dealing with here is a model of sex which says there is perfect male and perfect female, and then there is some imaginary x-axis where we're all, so I'm, for example, I mean, everybody is apparently less male than the perfect male and less female than the perfect female, and therefore we're all just in the middle. So so now, like, again, I would just instinctively say I'm male, but apparently, no, that's the wrong way of talking about it. Instead, I'm less male, but I'm slightly more male than some other people. There are some other people who are less male than me, but I'm less male than the perfect male. You'll notice how this is complete nonsense. And with all of this said, considering how strange and counterintuitive this way of understanding being male or female is, you would at least hope that there is a clear x-axis here, that what exactly is being described when we talk about somebody being male or female or more male or less male would be clear. But of course, the reality is it isn't. There is no like clear you're more male. Like how would that even work? Again, it's so bizarre. Like you look at all the variety of differences of sexual development and you think about how like the people who believe in this nonsense sex is a spectrum stuff will be like literally all they're doing is arbitrarily taking like people's differences of sexual development and being like, well, this makes you more male than this one, and this makes you less male than this one. And it's like, what are you doing? So that's kind of my general issue, but I want to actually take it, the quote one by one. The persistence of intersex. So first of all, the very fact that this supposed scientist is using the term intersex is a bit weird. Like they would have to define that term, but obviously the term intersex is a term which you've really got to be careful with, because ultimately it could lead you to the bizarre conclusion that a biological male with like one difference of sexual development where like, for example, maybe they have some ovarian tissue that is of no reproductive function whatsoever. Its presence is just a complete anomaly, that you would then say, oh, they're intersex. And it's like, well, that would be absurd. No, that like, for example, I'm sure it's entirely possible that I could have some difference of sexual development, which means I just completely randomly in a, just spontaneous, whatever else, have some kind of female or, typically female tissue in my body. Maybe I actually have some ovarian tissue tucked away somewhere. Would it make sense to therefore say that I'm intersex? I think that's a pretty ridiculous claim to make. I think it's pretty obvious I'm biologically male. So, I don't know what intersex means here. And then if we continue, reminds me that there's a continuum. Now, obviously, as I've already said, I don't think there's any, I've never seen any intelligently presented take on how exactly sex can be a continuum, how somebody can be more male or less male. The reality is that even if we were talking about like intersex people existing, that would presumably mean between the two sexes. And of course, when you actually look at examples where you get the closest to anything that could be described as intersex, we're talking about people who aren't like more male or less male, they're not like less male or less female. They're just, in that case, you would have to argue not male or not female at all, because their phenotype seems to have no reproductive function or whatever else. Or not be organized around any kind of reproductive function, I should say. So yeah, that wouldn't show that it's a continuum, because there's still a discrete difference between your phenotype being organized around a reproductive function and not being, if even such a category existed. So then it continues that we isolate people in the middle and say that they have a problem because they're reproductively incompetent or don't look right, whatever. Look, nobody should be saying that, but I'm not saying that. No gender critical person is saying that. Indeed, actually, of course, no gender critical person is saying that, mostly because I would argue that there actually isn't such a thing as a person whose phenotype is not organized around some kind of reproductive function. So yeah, that's not something I would say. None of us meets the criterion of being the perfect male or the perfect female. I've already addressed that nonsense. Then it says we are all intersex, which, to be honest, seems to be like a bit of a bizarre take, because it's like, okay, at that point, you're almost saying that like the category of intersex doesn't even exist. Like if we're all intersex, then what's intersex activism about? It doesn't make any sense to me. The reality is that I mean, yeah, it's just a bizarre claim built on top of a very bizarre foundation. So let's continue.
Following from that, biological reality does not actually differentiate people. We do through discourse.
Yeah, sure, but we do based on biological reality. So, I mean, it's you're right in a way, but it's functionally a distinction without a difference.
In a sense, everyone's biological makeup is entirely unique to themselves. Certainly, a person who has a penis will have different genitals from someone who has a vagina, but similarly, a person who has a penis will have different genitals than someone else with a penis. Just as every single chair is going to be slightly different from the next one, every single person will have different biological features, including cis women with face hair, cis men with wider hips or smaller shoulders.
Okay, so I just had to... So basically, yeah, the point there is we're all different, but that doesn't mean we can't categorize these differences at all. Indeed, we should categorize these differences. The point about like we're all related in some way, or well, we're all different from each other and similar to each other in some ways. Like that's the whole thing with kind of taxonomical classification. I am ultimately I'm only different from a giant squid in terms of like when you're talking about kind of my genetic relation, in terms of a matter of degree from the way that I'm different from you watching this right now, or indeed like my sister or anybody else. We are all related. We're all connected, if you like. And the point is, the conclusion there isn't, so let's just not draw any distinctions at all. The conclusion we should reach there is, okay, so let's think about what basis there is for distinguishing people. Considering that we're all different to some degree, and there are always going to be distinctions, we then need to think, okay, so with that in mind, what distinctions matter? And that's the question. And of course, that's not just some arbitrary exercise. There's a reason why we have the different kind of taxonomical classifications where we said, okay, these things that are, less related to these other things, they're in different families, and these things are in different phylums, and these things are in different, genuses or whatever else. These things are different species, so on and so forth. These things are different breeds. There's a reason why we have those classifications, and it's not just like arbitrary, and it's not just something you can just be like, oh, let's just completely ignore it. And indeed, I mean, you can also apply this to racial kind of, our conception of different people's races. And as always, the gender critical analogy here is far better, works far more, where we, of course, acknowledge that race is a classification that has some basis for it, that, of course, there are differences and those differences are relevant, but we also talk about the fact that these distinctions should not be a basis for discrimination or anything like that. That's exactly what our opinion should be on biological sex. It's what our take should be on race. Like, basically, we can talk about how these distinctions shouldn't matter, but that doesn't mean we should just say, well, let's just completely pretend that these distinctions don't exist, because you know what? We're all related in some way. That's not a very intelligent take.
It's not much of a stretch to say that if some women can have face hair, some women can have flat chests, some women can have XY chromosomes while still having a vagina, then some women can have a penis too.
That's an absolutely ridiculous take. That's like saying it's not much of a stretch to say that some black people can have, mustaches, some black people can have, whatever, I could continue forever. That therefore we can say some black people can be white Caucasians with European ancestry. No, that's a massive stretch. The point is, what you're doing is you're talking about things which are irrelevant to our ultimate definition of female and saying, well, if these irrelevant things can be, variable, then can't this thing which is essential to our definition be variable too? And that is very obviously complete nonsense. Indeed, you have to, based on that, you'd have to say that definitions just have no purpose at all. Any way we define a word, we could then say, well, if this can be different from, if there can be variation based on all these things which are irrelevant to the ultimate definition of this word, then why can't we just say that there can be variation on something which is essential to this definition of the word? That would be complete nonsense. To use the chair analogy that Malmrose Projects has used several times in this video, there's a huge variety of different chairs, But if you say, well, if some chairs can be cushiony, some chairs can be made of wood, some chairs can be made of metal, it's not that much of a stretch from that to say that some chairs can be, electronic devices that you talk into and they transfer. No, the reality is that this is not a chair, it's a microphone. You see the point? The fact that there can be an infinite, let's be honest, infinite variation in chairs doesn't mean that it's not that much of a stretch to just completely do away with the definition of chair altogether. In the exact same way, there can be infinite variation for biological females, but that's not a good basis for doing away with the definition of biological female altogether.
As such, the categories of male and female no longer reflect all of the information we have available about biological configurations.
But just for the record, this says trans women aren't male, which it's worth noting, like, I've seen so many people be like, oh, nobody's saying that trans women aren't male. Well, people are literally saying trans women aren't male.
Thus, to say that a trans woman is biologically male and that this is somehow a biological reality is not accurate.
Wait, okay, I have to go back, sorry.
Too. As such, the categories of male and female no longer reflect all of the information we have available about biological configurations.
But it doesn't have to reflect all the information. Oh, that's so dumb. Okay, wait, so and then...
Thus, to say that a trans woman is biologically male and that this is somehow a biological reality is not accurate.
Okay, that is complete nonsense. So the actual logic presented there is the categories of biological male and biological female don't account for all possible variations in biology. Therefore, it's not accurate to say that biological males are biological males. That's basically the argument you get there. As if, a classification has to be able to account for every single possible conceivable aspect of reality, or else it's not a valid classification. That is absurd. It's like, for example, if I said that, let's say I distinguish between suns and planets and asteroids, and somebody could say, well, there are a huge variety of suns and there are a huge variety of planets and there are a huge variety of asteroids, so just distinguishing between suns, planets, and asteroids doesn't account for every single possible variation in celestial bodies. Therefore, I guess the distinction between suns and planets and asteroids just doesn't exist. No, that's nonsense. It's so obviously nonsense to suggest that a categorization needs to account for every single possible variability, or every single possible instance of variability, or every single possible, arena of variability, in order to be a valid definition. No, the only thing that sex categorization is trying to distinguish is what gamete, your phenotype, is organized around facilitating the reproductive function of. That's the only thing it's distinguishing. So any variability within that is not something, is irrelevant to the validity of this distinction. That whole argument is just completely ridiculous.
Nobody is really biologically male. We really do have penises and vaginas. We really do have XY and XX chromosomes. These things are real, but the categories we use to distinguish people based on these expected features are based on expectations that simply don't reflect what we actually see occur.
Okay, so the claim there, first of all, nobody's really biologically male, and the answer for why, or the reason why nobody's really biologically male, I guess, is because because these things that we observe exist, but our categorization of those things as making somebody biologically male isn't real. And it's the point is, if everything that biological male is describing is real, then biological male is real. That should be really obvious. That's so simple. And I can't believe you wouldn't be able to understand that. The point, but even, it's kind of weird, because even if, not, so what? Even if you say, well, biological male is an arbitrary classification, well, sure, but if the things it's describing are real, then we can always just go back to the things it's describing. If you're acknowledging that the things being described by biological male, like the hormones and genitalia and gonads and chromosomes, if you're acknowledging that all those things are real, we can go back to those things. So there's no way around biological reality, as much as you're trying to find some kind of weird, nitpicky, linguistic path around it. There's just no way around it. And it's completely ridiculous. I just want to make sure there's nothing else silly said, because I was only focusing on the first thing.
These things are real, but the categories we use to distinguish people based on these expected features are based on expectations that simply don't reflect what we actually see occur.
Okay, so the claim was based on expectations we don't see, don't reflect what we actually see occur. That's not true at all. There is no, any expectation that somebody has about the biological sex binary is completely backed up by reality. There is nothing that we're not seeing occur. And indeed, actually, it's worth noting that even if, you were to grant the reality of, okay, there are some people who could be described as intersex because it's so ambiguous, they're a minority of cases, indeed quite an extreme minority of cases. So you can't be well, we don't see these two distinct sex categories in reality, or sexual characterizations in reality. It's yes, we very much do in the vast, vast majority of cases. Even if you want to say, well, it's not a true binary because, actually, maybe you can argue these people do qualify, these particular exceptions do qualify as intersex. Even granting that, which I'm not, but even granting it, it would still be true that in the vast majority of cases, the characterization of males and females is incredibly relevant it's correct and it's relevant to our understanding of biological reality. So yeah, this is just nonsense.
As such, biologically male carries no meaning beyond trying to assert that a trans woman is a man, simply because we expect people born with penises to be men.
Okay, biological male carries no meaning apart, oh my goodness, the narcissism, the absolute narcissism. So if somebody says, hey, can these two people reproduce? And you say, well, yeah, one of them's biologically male and one of them's biologically female. Then according to you, the only function of that observation that somebody's biologically male is to invalidate the identity of trans-identified people? No. Indeed, it's worth noting, by the way, this is also the, I like using this word, the speciesism of the whole thing as well. Because it's people do seem to forget, and, gender-critical people are guilty of this too, that your understanding of biological sex has to acknowledge the fact that all sexually reproductive species have biological sex. And not just that, they all have a sex binary. The sex binary exists across every single species that reproduces sexually. And based on that, the claim is even more ridiculous because it's when we look at some, mollusks or something, and say, well, one of these, is a biological male and the other one's a biological female, then according to you, the reason we're doing that is so that we can invalidate, I would assume, the identities of trans-identified human beings, or do you think that there are trans-identified mollusks? I'm not sure. I don't think the sheer brazen narcissism of that statement deserves too much of a response, but yeah, very simply put, there are many, many, many reasons why we acknowledge. In fact, it's worth noting, by the way, that I don't, this is getting it backwards. The reason why I invalidate the identities of trans-identified people is because I don't think it's helpful in terms of understanding the actual reality of the situation, which is best understood by recognizing the meaning and reality of biological sex categories. You are not the entire reason why I have the beliefs I do. I'm sorry to break that to you. I'm sorry if that upsets you to understand you're not the center of my entire universe. No, the only reason why I'm doing what I'm doing on this channel is because I think biological sex matters as a category. That's it. It's not because I want to upset or invalidate trans-identified people. If trans-identified people didn't want to undermine the relevance of biological sex as a category or a categorization and a referent for whether you're a man or woman, if they didn't want to do that, I wouldn't have a problem with them. So yeah, it's just complete nonsense and completely the opposite of actual reality.
Male socialization.
Okay, I'm interested. So now we're done with the biology. Phew. We've had some crazy claims. Claims like that a biological male only exists to upset trans-identified males, and also that it was true that the sun revolved around the earth in the 1400s. But now we're on to socialization, so hopefully there's going to be fewer mistakes here.
This is one that comes a lot from TERFs and is used specifically against trans women. The idea is that trans women are men because we are socialized to be men.
No. You're already wrong. It's not that trans women are men because they're socialized to be men. Rather, It's that this is one reason why the reality that trans-identified males are men is relevant. This is an important distinction. Nobody's saying that the act of being socialized as a man makes you a man. What they're saying is that you can't just ignore the fact that that's how you were socialized, and that that's going to have implications for how you behave in society and things like that. That's the important point. Ultimately, I mean, again, to go back to race, people say race is real and that its effects are real. Like the effects of race in terms of the implications of it for people's lives are real, and that makes race a reality. That's, it's quite a common expression from kind of racial equality activists. They'll say, well, race is real because the effects of race in your life, what it means for you, these things are real. And in a similar sense, you could say gender is real in that its effects are real. And we can't just be like, oh, well, gender's just a made up social construct, therefore it's irrelevant. No, the reality is if you're socialized as a man, that's going to have an effect on you. And of course, it's not really surprising that so many trans-identified males do seem to have this male entitlement, narcissism, violent tendencies, sexual fetishism. These are all kinds of things that you'd expect to see from men much more than you'd expect to see from women. So that's an example of why it matters that these people are actually men. That these people are biological males who are socialized as men. And again, a really good example of this, which I covered, is in my video, How Trans Identity Lies About Reality, where I talk about the fact that when you look at instances of like covering sexual assault, and it will say, this woman, she committed this sexual assault, and then you look and it's obviously a man, and you are left, and obviously that's relevant in that case because men are far more likely to commit sexual assault. So you're simply lying about reality if you tell me that a woman's committed a sexual assault when actually it was just a man who was socialized as a man. That's lying about reality and ignoring the relevance of socialization that men experience when they're growing up.
Simply put, even if we identify as women, we are really men when it comes to how we act and think, so it doesn't matter how we identify.
Yes. Okay, yeah, that's true.
This is very obvious bullshit to anyone who understands socialization.
Okay, let's see.
First of all, when it comes to messages we receive about what it means to be a man, everyone sees those messages, no matter who you are. We all see messages about what it means to be a man.
But are you okay? Yeah, I agree. The point is, you're acting as if like it's irrelevant that you're given those messages while also being told you are a man. Like, are you suggesting that the experiences of men and women should be equivalent when it comes to like expectations of what it's like to be a man, because we all see those same messages, and that it's irrelevant that women actually grow up being women and seeing those messages? That's completely ridiculous. We do all see those messages, but we're going to, like, that's literally like saying that, well, it's ridiculous to say that, like, let's suppose you live in an incredibly like race segregated society where like there are all of these like gross expectations about what it means to be a particular race, let's say a black person versus a white person. And then you say, so let's say it's a society where there's like all of this propaganda everywhere that says like, this is the way a white person should be. And then you say, well, it's ridiculous to suggest that this will have some big impact on the way that white people will behave and the way white people will view themselves, because black people will see that exact same message too. Do you not see how that's a completely ridiculous claim to be making? And yet that's exactly the claim you're making here. Well, why would this idea of like the ideal man and masculinity and all this stuff, why would it only affect men when women see it too? I mean, it does affect women, just not remotely in the same way, because women aren't viewed as men. And indeed, men aren't viewed as women.
We all see messages about what it means to be a man or a woman, and trans men internalize the messages of womanhood, not of manhood.
Okay, look, here's the thing. You can say that, but it's not true. Ultimately, even if you wanted to, even if you're like a little kid and you want to view yourself as a woman, the fact of the matter is other people aren't going to view you as a woman. Like ultimately, even if like that, you're also ignoring like the experience of like being raised even as a baby. Like the problem is, and this is a big issue, there are studies that show that the socialization of men and women actually has an effect even when we're talking about babies, because people will subconsciously treat babies differently if they, there have been all sorts of studies where like, people have been told because obviously a lot of time you can't tell with a baby. They've been told a baby is a girl or a boy, either or, and people have treated the babies differently. And, again, Cordelia Fine's Delusion of Gender, I believe, is a good book that really goes into this. Is it called Delusions of Gender? I hope I'm right. Anyway, the point is that this is an established thing. So the point is, even before you are able to communicate to anybody your hecking valid trans identity, they've already treated you as a man based on the fact they've already observed you to be biologically male. So even if, as soon as you're able to, even if your first word is, it's ma'am, even if your first word is telling everybody that you actually identify as a woman, and even if everybody actually went along with that, and every single person in your life never ever thought to treat you differently based on the fact they could observe that you were a biological male, even if all of that, and you'll notice that's a lot to be granting, you still would have been socialized as a male during a particularly formative period of your life. So that's complete nonsense. But the point is, even if you are saying I interpret it this particular way, I interpret it this way, I interpret it the same way a woman would interpret it, which how can you know that? But I interpret it the way a woman would interpret it. Well, that's not going to change the fact that people are going to be treating you differently. It doesn't matter if you interpret things differently if you're actually getting a different experience. Sure, let's imagine I tried my utmost to interpret everything that happened to me as a woman. Well, that's not going to change the fact that what happened to me is different from what actually happened to actual women, aka biological females, based on the fact they were observed to be women. So this is just complete nonsense. I'm not denying, I want to stress this, I'm not denying that the experiences of biological males with gender dysphoria are going to be different from the experiences of other biological males who don't have gender dysphoria. But I don't think you'd be like, oh, I just experienced it as a woman. No, you didn't.
Demonstrably so. Most trans women see masculine gender expectations growing up as some of the most traumatic moments of their upbringing, myself included. Having the internal...
Very healthy. Look, the reality is that, so it should be pointed out, that doesn't mean you weren't socialized as a male. Indeed, are you, based on that logic, every single, nerdy kid who wasn't good at sports, wasn't socialized as a man? Yeah, I'm sure, here's the thing. You seem to be assuming that, you seem to be living in this crazy world where being socialized as a male, or being socialized as a man, either, turns you into James Bond meets Arnold Schwarzenegger, or it turns you into a trans-identified male. No. The reality is that, first of all, everybody has a complicated I would argue everybody has a complicated relationship to the depiction of idealized masculinity in society. Everybody. But second of all, certainly not everybody just turns into the kind of hyper-masculine jock bro. And the reality is, everybody has an experience where everybody is affected in some way negatively, I guess is the point I'm getting at here, by the stereotypical depiction of traditional masculinity. You're talking absolute nonsense if you think that every single person who's been socialized as a man has had the universal experience of seeing masculinity being yes, that. No, the reality is the fact that you found these stereotypical depictions of masculinity to be traumatic does not prove that you were not socialized as a man. And by the way, do you actually think that all non-trans identified women or non-trans identified females are all totally on board with the traditional depiction of femininity? No, again, I want to stress, not being bothered by the traditional depictions of femininity and masculinity and even finding them traumatic does not mean that you weren't socialized as a man or indeed weren't socialized as a woman. That is complete nonsense.
Internal gender identity of womanhood with the expectations of masculinity pushed onto us has devastating effects for us psychologically, with a lot of trans women having PTSD, personality disorders, and anxiety.
Well, yeah, okay, look, again, the point is I'm not saying that men with gender dysphoria don't have different experiences from regular men. Of course they do. The thing is, you're not evidencing, this is the issue, you're not evidencing that trans-identified males are socialized as women, or indeed aren't socialized as men. You're just evidencing that their socialization as men takes a different form. And indeed, I should point out that, of course, as you're fond of pointing out, there is a huge variety to things. And ultimately, there are a huge variety of ways that you can experience being socialized as a man. So all you're doing here is making the rather uninteresting point that you were socialized as a man in a different way from how other people are socialized as a man. Okay, that's fine. Every single man is socialized as a man in a slightly different way, but that's not proving you weren't socialized as a man at all.
Disorders from experiences we had while in the closet.
Oh, see, I like that. So there's even an admission that, like, basically it can be assumed that trans-identified individuals were in the closet. So that completely rules out the possibility that people were still treating you like a man. So to claim you weren't, like, if you were in the closet, then presumably people weren't treating you like a hecking valid trans girl. They were treating you like a man. So you were being socialized as a man. So your nonsense about, but I interpreted it differently. You were still experiencing a fundamentally different socialization from that of people who are identified as women and recognized as women from a very early age.
Instead, it's a give and take, where we internalize some things and reject other things.
Yeah, sure, it's complicated.
And our perspective and autonomy within our own lives can go a long way in how much we internalize.
Yeah, sure, it's complicated. Like, that's the point. Nobody's saying that, like, again, you seem to have this idea that, like, people are saying that all trans-identified males are, like I say, like, just super masculine jock bros. Like, just out, like, if, like, again, you seem to think that there's just two options. You're either like this huge, hulking, great big masculine guy pumping iron all the time, or you're, trans-identified cat girl. No, the reality is that nobody's saying that you didn't have a complicated relationship with your socialization as a man, but you still were socialized as a man. I agree it's a give or take thing. I agree that if you don't like what's being put down, you're going to respond a particular way to that compared to somebody who's maybe a bit more on board with the idea of living up to traditional stereotypical masculinity. By the way, a point you haven't even made is, of course, that socialization as a man varies from culture to culture, class to class, even time period to time period. So that's another point to consider. But yeah, nobody's denying it's complicated.
Being a trans woman, it becomes difficult to internalize masculine messages growing up because it conflicts with our conception of ourselves as women. As a result, we don't internalize the messages, but we still fear the consequences of failing to comply with gender norms.
You're saying it's difficult to internalize them, and you're saying you don't internalize them. First of all, look, it's asking a lot of me to trust in your self-awareness. And I really don't know that I am expecting that you would have been able to fully recognize whether or not you have internalized any, like, messages that amount to, basically you being socialized as a man. I'm not going to take your word for that. But whatever. The point is, even still, so far, the only real claim, the only substantial claim you've made is just, well, it's different. We respond to it differently. We respond to it. And, like, well, apart from just saying, like, claiming that you don't internalize those messages at all, I'm really not sure I can buy into the claim, like, oh, I was constantly inundated with these, these messages about what it meant to be who I was, and I never once internalized those messages at all. No.
In my own life, this didn't translate into putting on a masculine persona. It translated into sitting in my bedroom and crying a lot because I didn't understand why men were so awful to me. I literally could not internalize the idea that I needed to be more manly, and that caused a great level of stress.
Well, you say you literally... Look, I don't think you get this, okay? Most men... Like, I didn't really... Okay, so to be fair, there were points in my life when I did internalize it. First of all, like, you're literally like... I can't buy into this idea. Like, the implication here is that no trans-identified male ever went through a period of, like, thinking, I wish I were more manly. Like, apparently, according to this person, no trans-identified male ever actually, like, thought... like, went through any period of, like, thinking, hey, what if I were more manly? Wouldn't that be better? Which I find incredibly hard to believe, that people who are so bent out of shape, like, according to you, you were literally crying, and yet the idea of, like, wouldn't it fix things if I could just be more manly? Never even entered your mind. I find that hard to believe. No, but the reality is, first of all, it should be pointed out that, yeah, I think I probably did have moments of thinking like, oh, it would be nice to be more manly. But it's important to understand, like, it doesn't take much maturing before you realize that actually the best thing you can be is just who you are and who you want to be. And like, obviously, again, the implication of this almost seems to be that like, if say, for example, you're not so stereotypically manly, and again, like I say, stereotypically manly is kind of a difficult term to deal with anyway, but that you just spend your entire life with being like conscious of, oh, I'm not manly enough. No, the reality is most men, while they will be affected by this idea to some extent, are going to, by and large, just be like, well, you know what? I've got other things to think about. I'm happy with who I am. It comes down to the individual. So again, it's been pointed out before that one of the offensive things about this whole trans identity nonsense is that it kind of like brings about this implication that people who aren't trans identified have just like fully passively gone along with like expectations of, or indeed actually actively, but basically are like fully on board with expectations of gender stereotypes. And I 100% am on board with that being a valid criticism. It very much seems to me that, especially from this, a mainstream belief amongst trans-identified people is like, hey, I'm not like the people who aren't trans-identified. I actually had complicated, difficult thoughts about the idea of being manly. And it's like, yeah, you and every other man. Yeah, I'm sorry, but that's just the reality of the situation. Anyway.
In this sense, trans men don't undergo male socialization, but closeted woman socialization.
Okay, first, there's no closeted woman socialization is nonsense. First of all, yeah, I just want to point out, by the way, like crying because you're expected to be manly, that's certainly much closer to male socialization than it is to female socialization. I don't think any female socialization involves crying because of the immense pressure to be more manly. Hey, there's a helicopter outside. There's an airbase near us. Anyway, unfortunately not close enough to actually ever create sound interferes with things. But yeah, that's point one. And second, yeah, like closeted woman socialization. Again, first of all, I just can't buy into this idea of like, oh yeah, where every single person thinks you're a man and is treating you like a man, but you just interpret it differently so it doesn't count. No, if you're still being treated like a man, you're still getting that privilege. You're still getting those ideas of like male entitlement pushed upon you. You're still getting all of that stuff and just saying, well, I interpreted it differently. I think it's just complete nonsense. But yeah, the term closeted woman is just complete nonsense. No, there's no such thing as a closeted woman, because women are obviously women and are observed to be as such, based on biological reality.
We internalize messages of womanhood and have a self-perception of womanhood. Thus, the idea
you internalize perceptions of womanhood while not actually having those messages like put upon you in the same way that women have those messages put upon you or put upon them. Like that's the kind of ridiculous thing. You're internalizing these messages, but not actually experiencing what real women experience. And that is the big difference. And that's the thing. And like this goes for, obviously it goes for trans-identified females too. Like saying, oh, I internalized ideas of masculinity. Okay, but you didn't experience masculinity. You didn't experience masculinity being pushed upon you. You didn't experience the expectations of masculinity. You didn't experience being treated as a man. You just had this like outsider's perspective of what it would be like to be a man. And you internalized based on your outsider's perspective. That's exactly what's happening here. You had, you never were observed to be a female. Therefore, you never were treated as a woman. Therefore, you were never subject to, the actual treatment that women are on the receiving end of. And therefore, the only thing there was for you to internalize is your outsider's perspective of, well, that's what it seems like it is to be a woman. So I guess that seems to be what I want. That's not the same thing as being socialized as a woman. Spoiler alert, actual women aren't socialized as women by observing the experience of being treated as a woman from an outsider's perspective while they're actually being treated as men. That was your experience. It's not the experience of women.
Identity of a woman, but we have to keep these in the closet throughout our early life. As such, we don't develop masculine habits or mindsets, but are harmed for being incapable of doing so. This is very...
First of all, I want to point this out. This is implying that trans-identified people can't be or trans-identified males can't be masculine. And this is actually incredibly sexist because you're implying that what makes trans-identified males females is that they weren't masculine, or that there is some association between being a woman and being unable to be masculine. The reality is women can be masculine and men can be feminine. And yeah, this idea that you're saying, well, because we were women, we were incapable of being masculine. Okay, so you think women are incapable of being masculine? Is that what you're saying? You think women are incapable of wanting to emulate masculinity? Is that what you're saying? Because that's nonsense. Women can want to do that stuff, and it doesn't make them men if they want to emulate masculinity. That's sexist. That's nonsense. That's regressive. That's bigoted. Anyway.
Very much in line with what we expect to see via socialization theory. Just as cis women internalize the identity of womanhood and often experience trauma at the face of what men expect them to be, so do trans women.
Oh, not the same thing. Not the same thing at all. The difference is that women experience trauma. First of all, I'm irritated because I'm very much aware of what actually causes women to experience trauma. There's a very significant thing that happens to a disturbingly high number of women, which is traumatic for them, and that is abuse and sexual assault, not men's expectations of what they should be. To act as if like the like the go-to example of trauma experienced by women is what men expect of them. I mean, I suppose in some sense you're right in that men, due to their male entitlement, will often expect things from women, which will then cause those men to lash out violently when they don't get those things, a bit like what the trans identity movement is doing when women won't give up their private sex-based spaces. Yeah, I suppose in that sense you're right, but you're kind of not really accurately representing the situation, especially when you're trying to present that as analogous to your experience of being expected to be masculine because you were a biological male. Of course, the reality is these two things are very different. Even if we were to ignore that this is not the main reason women experience trauma, if we're talking about women experiencing trauma because they grew up with the expectation that they would be women and they would be feminine, that's not the same thing as biological males growing up with the expectation that they would be men and they would be masculine. In fact, you could argue that if we're talking about a binary of men versus women, then the experience of growing up with the expectation of being a man is the exact opposite to the experience of most women, not something similar to it at all. So yeah, just completely ridiculous and kind of offensive.
It's just that men expect us to be two things simultaneously. The messages we internalize are about how we need to behave as women, and yet the messages that are inflicted on us by men are how we need to behave as men. We reject...
Yeah, the difference is, so basically what you're saying is you're choosing to internalize this idea of like how you should be treated as women, because obviously that's not something which is being imposed upon you at all.
The masculine messages and internalize the messages of womanhood, but both are used to harm and traumatize us. Given this, male privilege goes out the window. Trans women do not have male privilege because privilege is something afforded to people by society.
Okay, look, the reality is you still do have male privilege, apart from anything else. You have male privilege because in order to rob yourself of that privilege, you literally have to dress up, put on makeup, do surgery to convince people. Like, if you didn't do any of that stuff, you would have all of the privilege that any man would have, because nobody would recognize you as anything other than a man if you didn't put on this costume of femininity. So of course you have privilege. The same way, by the way, that like you could say, well, if I dressed up convincingly as a woman, well, I guess maybe I wouldn't have so much privilege. But like ultimately that doesn't change the fact I'm a man. Also, by the way, it's important to understand, I'm not denying, like I've pointed this out before, that traditionally masculine men have more privilege than non-traditionally masculine men. And I'm also not denying that gender non-conforming people clearly are discriminated against and oppressed. Gender non-conforming people most definitely are. So the point is that saying, well, we get discriminated against as trans-identified males, actually, and therefore you don't have male privilege. No, you do have male privilege, but that male privilege is perhaps counteracted by you being gender non-conforming. But that's only if you choose to be gender non-conforming. The reality is you could continue to be trans-identified without being gender non-conforming, in which case you would forfeit no privilege at all. Indeed, there are many examples of men who clearly have not, like Eddie Izzard, for example, has not forfeited any male privilege. And yeah, many of the examples of biological males who only come out as trans into their 50s and 60s, they definitely did have male privilege. And they will claim, oh, I was in the closet the whole time. The reality is they had male privilege, and therefore it's pretty clear that trans-identified males can have male privilege. So this claim it goes out the window is complete nonsense.
Male privilege is not based on biosex. It's based on gender identity, and this is demonstrable because as soon as trans women come out, any notion of privilege goes right up the window.
Okay, so I got distracted really quick, but yeah, I want to deal with that question. Okay, so privilege isn't based on biology, it's based on identity. The reality is that no, it's not. Okay, like I think privilege is based on, first of all, biology. Yes, it is based on biology, and to deny that it is ridiculous, because the reality is that, for example, how do people know that I'm male? Spoiler alert, or a man. It's not because I identify as a man. People do not know that I'm a man because I identify as such. People know I'm a man because, dun 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 dun, I'm biologically male. One of the issues here is that you have to talk about how male privilege developed, or how patriarchy developed, which of course relates hugely to women's reproductive function and reproductive capacities. So that pretty much right out the window proves you wrong. Like ultimately, throughout history, women have been identified as women because they were biologically female. And ultimately, here's the thing, look, if I identified as a woman, I wouldn't suddenly lose my privilege because nobody would even know that I identify as a woman. Like, I don't tell people, I don't walk up to people and go, hi, Michael, he, him pronouns. No, I just trust that people will know that I'm a man, and reliably people do. And any privilege I get from that is a privilege I get not because of my identity, but because of my biology. Now, the only way in which that privilege is undercut, like I say, is to do with gender nonconformity, which is not the same thing as identity. Yes, if I were a cross-dresser, I imagine that would have implications for the privilege that I would have. There would be some ways, I would still have male privilege in some ways, but in other ways that would undercut my privilege, because I think as a masculine kind of gender-conforming man, you do have more privilege than you do as a non-conforming man. But ultimately, the point is that's still got nothing to do with my identity. Identity has nothing to do with it. And nobody's ever been like, obviously the classic example you can look at here is trans-identified females. Nobody's ever been about to like attack or harass or anything else a trans-identified female, and then we've gone, he, him pronouns. They go, oh, sorry, sir. Sorry to inconvenience you. Oh, what a shame. No, that's complete nonsense. So yeah, it's got nothing to do with identity.
High rates of discrimination, poverty, harassment, and violence for trans people. High rates of familial rejection and very few legal protections. Trans women often...
Yeah, here's the thing, this is like a gay person trying to argue they don't have male privilege. Like, nobody's arguing that you don't have other things that mean that you are discriminated against. Of course you do. Yes, I can recognize that, I will even concede that in some contexts, the belief of trans identity is discriminated against, in the same way that the belief of Islam or Catholicism in some sense is discriminated against. But ultimately, first of all, it doesn't make it a correct belief, and obviously it doesn't make the experience of being discriminated against universal. But of course, apart from that, a very likely reason you're going to be discriminated against is actually because of gender nonconformity. So again, these are all reasons you might be discriminated against, but that doesn't mean that you don't have male privilege.
Often have to go into sex work in order to survive, and none of these things resemble male privilege in any way.
Well, again, it's complete nonsense. It's like, Cornish miners had to go into the coal mines to survive. No, so how could they have had male privilege? Look, they still had male privilege. Again, you don't seem to understand, like, for the group of people who talk about intersectionality all the time, you don't seem to understand the idea that people have different identities and belong to different demographics, and some of those things can be, like, ways in which they're discriminated against, some of them can be ways in which they're not discriminated against. Obviously, women face discrimination for being women, but they may face certain privileges for being straight or wealthy, whatever else, or indeed white. That's just the reality of the situation. That doesn't mean they're not discriminated against for being women. And likewise, if you're discriminated against for being poor or gay or whatever else, that doesn't mean that you're not privileged to being a man.
We are not afforded privileges after we come out. Instead, we lose any that we may have had.
No, yeah, that's just complete nonsense. The claim that you're not afforded privileges, first of all, you are. Like, I mean, one of the issues here is you can't really, like, making any kind of blanket statement like this is always a bit weird, because there are certainly many contexts where actually trans-identified people do receive preferable and favorable treatment in a lot of kind of like representation things. It's like, oh, you know, we should have representations. Let's get a trans-identified person on. But also, for example, there are instances where trans-identified males have been able to access spaces reserved for women. So that's actually a privilege they're being given of, oh, now you can actually do this thing which other men, by the way, can't do. So there are examples of where actually particular privileges, advantages, and accommodations are made for trans-identified people. So it's too simplistic, like, well, we aren't afforded privilege. Well, in many ways you are.
As for privileges afforded to trans women in the closet, this is privilege at the expense of identity. It's what I call conditional privilege. And
okay, so yeah, okay, here the argument is, well, sure, we get privilege, but we only get privilege because we're not being true to ourselves. First of all, again, it's worth noting, I think you could, like, the problem is, actually, you can identify as a woman as much as you like and still receive male privilege. Indeed, I actually think not only could you do that internally, I reckon you could probably tell people you identify as a woman, and most of the time you're still going to get male privilege because they're not going to perceive you as a woman. The point at which you might potentially stop having that privilege is if you were a gender non-conforming biological male. And at that point, it's nothing to do with your identity, it's to do with gender non-conformity. But yeah.
But the problem is here that you are severely limited in how you can interact online. You can't show your face, you can't show your voice, you can't act like yourself. You must pretend to be something you're not.
Okay, so basically the point being made there, I'll have to simplify it a bit because it was a bit long. Basically it was saying, well, women are perceived as men online a lot of the time, or can be perceived as men, and therefore they don't have, you know, at that point they still, you know, they don't have the discrimination that women often get. And that's kind of like how trans-identified males are perceived as men, but, you know, and they don't get the discrimination that they would get if they were recognized as women. But the reality is that the claim just made there was, of course, well, you can't show your true self. But the reality is that for women, that's actually true. Women online, if they want to not face discrimination, they can't show their true self. They can't show that they're women because that will lead to people being misogynistic against them. But trans-identified males can show them their true self because who they truly are is a male. They can show their maleness to their heart's content, and it's not going to result in any loss of privilege. And the reality is, you might say, well, they can't show their trans identity, but yes, well, you're technically right, they can't, but that's not because of some discrimination against it. It's because showing your trans identity is completely incoherent. There is no way of showing your trans identity because your trans identity is completely meaningless. So you're sort of right, but not in the way you want to be.
Otherwise, you face increased harassment, including sexual harassment, and increased risk of all sorts of abuse, such as the kind we saw with Gamergate. You do not have privilege if you have to constantly self-police in order to retain said privilege.
But what are you policing? Like, you just can't stop yourself from going, she, her pronouns. The issue is you're acting as if, like, your identity in this context is something substantial, but you haven't actually explained what it even means to identify as a woman. And, you know, if it is something substantial, I'd like to know what it is. But right now you're just saying, look, my identity isn't being recognized. Like, well, what do you mean your identity? Your identity is just what you want to be called. As far as I can tell, it's not describing any actual truth claim, any actual reality. So what is it you're even talking about? I have no idea. Ultimately, you know, there's nothing you're not showing because there's nothing I can conceive of you actually being able to show here.
This is true of women online, and it's true of trans women in the closet. Conditional privilege is not privilege. And
I mean, it still kind of is, it's worth noting, like, because there's the alternative. Like, conditional privilege is a privilege when the alternative is being discriminated against no matter what. Like, can I just point that out? Because you're basically arguing here that if you're in a situation where, like, because here's the thing, first of all, I mean, you could kind of argue almost all privilege is in some sense conditional, because ultimately privilege isn't just like, you get like, it's not like a universal basic income where you just get it for doing absolutely nothing. No, conditional privilege is usually like a way of kind of supplementing your success. Like nobody's arguing, for example, when you talk about male privilege, that biological males can just automatically make huge amounts of money just like nothing. No, but the point is that biological males tend to have certain advantages when they're actually trying to succeed in a certain area. Like it's not really a surprise that I'm not the CEO of a huge company because, well, I haven't actually tried to do so. But it's also not really a surprise that if I really tried to become like a CEO or really try to climb up the business ladder, I would probably have a lot more success than a woman doing so. So in that sense, you could say, well, you always need to show some initiative for privilege to have it. Well, usually you need to show at least some initiative. So it's not as if like privilege is just like a blank check. Like here, for doing absolutely nothing, here's your, no, like it's something which basically gives you an unfair advantage, but still probably asks something of you. But obviously the main point I'm trying to make here is this claim that you don't have privilege if it's conditional privilege is nonsense, because you still have more privilege than a woman who, like, I mean, even looking at this example, you're literally saying like, well, women have this conditional privilege only online, but you have that conditional privilege and other trans-identified males have that conditional privilege all of the time, 100% of the time. So that's actually, like, I think if you asked women, hey, would you like to have a situation where you can be completely free from any discrimination for being a woman all of the time, they would bite your hand off at the opportunity. Even if you said, oh, but I mean, literally, here's the kind of hilarious thing. Women literally have done this. There are so many stories of women pretending to be and identifying as biological males in order to have less privilege. So that's the kind of, like, literally you are evidencing here male privilege. Like, this is the best example of male privilege and male socialization when it comes to entitlement I've ever heard, because you're literally in a situation where you can easily not have any discrimination at all, and you're complaining about it. Meanwhile, actually discriminated against people, if you said, hey, guess what? You can be completely privileged, you can have nothing, no, all the discrimination you face is completely fine, and all you have to do is identify a particular way. That's not fair. I want to clarify this. That shouldn't be expected of people. And it's not fair that that's something which people are asked to do. But, I mean, to be fair, privilege in and of itself, almost definitionally, isn't a fair thing. It's an advantage you get unfairly. But it's not fair, but it's most people all people who are actually discriminated against would love that option. If you walked up to, black people in like the 1960s in America, and I'm not saying black people aren't discriminated against now in America, but certainly they were more so in the 1960s, and said like, hey, all the segregation, all of like the police brutality, all of that stuff, you can identify out of it, no problems asked, no questions asked, rather. They would jump at that opportunity. Like most people would. And yeah, like I say, women in the past have. There are many examples of women who have dressed up like men, identified as men, basically done their best to be perceived as men, in contrast to their actual identity, so that they can succeed in life, so that they can be freed from the systemic oppression women face. So yeah, you are literally showing your privilege here by being like, well, I have all of the advantages of like not actually being subject to any discrimination at all, but I just don't like it because I have to lie about who I am. Well, again, people who are actually discriminated against, they would love that. Like the situation you're complaining about as like being evidence of your discrimination is a situation that actual oppressed people would do anything to be able to be in that situation.
The male socialization and male privilege arguments, simply put, are bullshit.
No, they're not. They're actually pretty, I mean, literally you've ended this section by evidencing your male privilege, so.
Trans is a mental illness.
Okay. Oh wow, we've still got a while left. Well, like 3 minutes, let's see.
Actually, no. Trans was a mental illness.
Oh my goodness, this is so dumb. Look, the reality is that you can't just say like that the DSM-5 is the authority. This is an appeal to authority. Okay, we'll let the point be made.
Heterosexuality became destigmatized and taken off the books as a mental disorder around the 1920s.
I'm kind of confused. Heterosexuality was considered a mental illness until the 1920s? I don't even know what to say there. But so far, I'll just say, like, so far the only point that's been made is well, they're just like stigmatizing it as a mental illness. Here's the thing, literally, like, this is something that, like, you literally admitted that you were like crying, and like, as far as I'm concerned, if somebody's experiencing incredible mental distress, like for me, a good like way of understanding mental illness is if something incredibly benign is causing you serious like mental health issues. And that's exactly what we have with trans identity. It's something where the reality is, I do think the sense in which trans identity is not a mental illness is that at this point, trans identity can literally mean nothing. Like, the problem is, saying that trans identity is a mental illness, I think, is wrong, because it's giving trans identity almost too much credit for actually being something substantial. Now, I will say that gender dysphoria is a mental illness, because that actually is experiencing extreme mental discomfort at the reality that you are a biological male or a biological female, and therefore a man or a woman. That is a mental illness, because something incredibly benign, literally reality itself, is causing you this mental health issues. It's like if somebody was incredibly distressed at the idea they were a human being, or incredibly distressed at the idea that they're white, or incredibly distressed at the idea that they have green eyes, or whatever else. It's a mental illness. There's no ambiguity to that.
And homosexuality became destigmatized and taken off the books as a mental disorder, I believe sometime around the 1980s or 1990s.
Okay, that's crazy that homosexuality was a mental disorder until the 1980s and 1990s. Shows what the DSM-5 knows.
This was done for a few reasons. One was, as the American Psychiatric Association themselves explained, was to get rid of the idea that trans people were in any way disordered. Second was because they recognized that the condition of stress that trans...
So you'll notice how here the focus is like not on the truth, or like how it makes sense to understand mental illness, but rather on the consequences. Like, well, we want to do this to remove the stigma and stuff like that. Well, look, you shouldn't be, like, those kind of political concerns shouldn't be motivating you to say that somebody being incredibly distressed at the reality that they're a man is anything other than a mental illness, because it obviously is.
Science does not argue anymore that trans is a mental illness, and emphatically argues the opposite. So don't look to...
Look, the reality is, I don't care what science says, because science isn't my boss. Science isn't in charge of me. My boss is common sense. I only care about science insofar as science is actually correct. If science is wrong, if what scientists are saying is nonsense, then they're wrong. It's nonsense. I don't care. You can't say to me, science says this. It's like, look, if science is talking nonsense, if science is telling me that somebody crying, having mental breakdowns because they're a man and they don't like the fact they're a man, if science is telling me that person is not mentally ill, I don't care. Obviously, it should be pointed out that, of course, science doesn't actually say anything. Science is simply a process. What you mean is certain organizations that claim to be scientific, but I would argue they're really not being such. They're just letting politics lead them.
Scientific explanations in order to defend transphobia. Trans people are more likely to commit suicide after transitioning.
Well, they're more likely to commit suicide than people who aren't trans-identified.
This argument was made based on a single study from Sweden.
This is following on from the mental illness thing, but okay.
The statistics overwhelmingly support that allowing trans people to transition and treating their gender identity as valid is vital to our psychological health.
Okay, so basically the whole point being made here, and this is pretty much at the end, so we've literally got 17 seconds left on the clock, and so far transphobia has not been debunked. But okay, so basically the claim there is just, well, it makes us happy to believe a delusion, and yeah, sure. Like, as far as I'm concerned, this is the most irrelevant point. Ultimately, it literally does not affect me one way or the other. Whether it makes you happy to believe a nonsense idea, it's still a nonsense idea. So there we go. If you could prove to me that Catholicism reduces people's... I mean, there literally is, like, I think there is stuff that shows, like, certain religious beliefs reduce people's risk of certain mental health issues, and, like, makes them happier and things like that. But that doesn't make the belief correct. When you tell me you are a woman, you are telling me a belief. You are telling me something which I can either say is true or false. And if you tell me something which is either true or false, the only thing that can convince me of that true or false claim is evidence that what you're saying is true. That it makes you happy is not evidence that a claim is true. It never is, it never has been, it never will be. Nothing becomes true because it makes you happy. And showing me all of this evidence that it improves your psychological health, if it's true, doesn't make it true. That's simply the reality of the situation.
Why can't you just be a feminine man?
Oh, wow. So we've got 10 seconds left on why can't you just be a feminine man. I guess the response is probably going to be something kind of like a joke. Let's see.
Why can't I just be an androgynous, non-binary trans woman? And why can't you mind your own business? Thanks for watching, and have a happy Pride Month, everyone.
Something sounds too good to be true.
I said that I was watching a lot of PBS Eons, and now you can see it, the evidence. So yeah, the reason why you can't be any kind of made-up identity is because it's just that, it's a made-up identity. Ultimately, it doesn't matter whether or not you want to be a feminine man. You are a man, there's nothing that can change that. If you act feminine, you're a feminine man. If you tell me you're an androgynous, non-binary whatever, you're still not that, because that's not describing reality. It's really that simple. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. My shoulder started hurting, and it makes me feel bad that my shoulder's hurting, and it would make me happy if my shoulder wasn't hurting. Therefore, my shoulder isn't hurting. Isn't it fun how that works? Isn't that a great system? Like, hey, here's my true-false claim, but just so you know, it would make me happy if this thing were true. I mean, to be fair, that would have been, considering this is also the video that argued it was true in the 1400s, that the sun revolved around the earth, I guess all that needed to happen is somebody to say, it improves my psychological health if the sun revolves around the earth. And then everyone would have gone, oh, like, that's what the opposition to Galileo should have been like. Everyone got, hey, Galileo, shut up, you bigot. Fab. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed. Please do like, share, subscribe. Comment below to let me know what you think. Although, actually, somebody's been doing that a lot recently, and it's really been getting to me. So I blocked them because they were just doing it all the time. And it was like the same thing over and over again. And I was like, I can't be bothered. So comment below to let me know what you think, as long as it's an interesting, insightful thought. It could be a kind of objection. I welcome objections. You're allowed to object, whether you're gender critical or not. Many gender critical people object to what I say in my videos, and it's fine. Many trans-identified people do too, and that's fine as well. Sometimes I might not respond to you because there's a variety of reasons I might not do that. But you may plant a nugget of an idea in my head, or something else. So do let me know. But yeah, just make sure it's not some like nonsense you're spamming, because that will irritate me. And yeah, it's the only thing that will get you blocked. Is just like spamming nonsense. Like if it's the same objection, like the thing is basically the real thing is if it's like irrelevant to the context of the video. That's when you'll get it. Like if I say, hey, let me know what you think, and then you comment and you're like, oh, 5 years ago you debated Vorsh and you lost it. No, it wasn't 5 years ago, but well, you know, like all that kind of stuff. Like just like things that are completely irrelevant. Yeah, I can't be doing with that. You don't deserve to comment if that's this kind of stuff you're going to be saying. Like just bring enough stuff that's irrelevant to the video. Whatever. I think a heron just flew past my window. It had very long legs. It only like flew past kind of. Okay. Anyway, yeah. Also, if you like this video, and you want to incentivize the production of more videos, or perhaps the better way to think of it is reward the production of the videos that are being produced through financial contribution, and you can give it on Patreon. That's really appreciated. And I'll just say thank you to my current patrons. In addition to the names scrolling past on your screen right now, I would like to give a special thanks to last month's patrons, one of whom does not want to be mentioned by name, but apart from that, Lemonade and Citrus. You're all very appreciated.